Siku and Jema, eh? In this video, we're looking at limits of cell size, so find that sheet. We want to see why can't cells be so big, like the size of a human or a dog or a mouse, and why can't a single cell be the size of an atom? What prevents it or keeps it in those ranges? Before we get to that, we should look at the units that we like to use for measuring size and distance with a microscope. And we like to use microns. Now, if you took a meter and divide it into 1,000 equal parts, you get a millimeter. If we take that tiny, tiny millimeter, divide it by 1,000, we get microns. So anytime we know the size in millimeters, we multiply by 1,000 to get microns. And anytime we know the size of microns, we divide by 1,000 to go back to millimeters. So Pneumonia Bacterium, that means a bacterium that causes pneumonia in a human. And its typical size, 0.1 microns. Red blood cell, we're looking at 8. White blood cell, you can see it's bigger than a red blood cell. Its diameter is roughly 3 times bigger, so we write down 25. This time we have to divide by 1,000, so we get 0.06 for human sperm cell. Human egg is bigger than the sperm, so 0.2 becomes 200. We multiplied by 1,000. Now, we're not talking about a whole leaf, it just says a leaf cell, and so they can vary typically from 200 to 400 microns. An ostrich egg, now there is a big cell, so 75 millimeters, 7.5 centimeters, which we know is 75,000 microns. And this nerve cell, not all nerve cells are going to be this long. This might be something like in your leg. And so if we're talking about 1,000,000 microns, we're saying, hey, that's 1,000 millimeters, which happens to equal 1 meter. So those are sort of extraordinary. Amoeba. Amoeba is something you may find in pond water. It's sort of a globular thing that oozes around, and then when it wants to eat something, it engulfs the prey and then dumps in digestive juices and consumes it and gets the material. So first we look at why cells cannot be too small. Simply put, the organelles themselves are going to be made up of atoms and molecules. So that's going to take up room, and then they have to have room to do what they are designed to do. If you're a ribosome, you've got to make proteins. If you're a nucleus, you've got to control the cell, and you're going to need room to do that. If you get to simpler kinds of cells, like a bacterium cell, well, it doesn't have all kinds of cell structures in it, like human cells and animal and plant cells. And so it can be smaller, but it will have genetic information that's going to take up a certain amount of space. It might have DNA or RNA in it. And viruses are smaller still, and of course viruses are in the news these days. Now we shift to the backside. Why cells can't be too big? Now, 2 of the reasons are fairly straightforward. And the first is that the cytoplasm would collapse on itself. It's very liquidy. It's like a pudding. If you remember the vitreous humor, if you had a bag of vitreous humor the size of a human, it's going to have a very hard time standing up. And so it would simply collapse. And so it's much better to have a lot of smaller cells and you put them together and you have a little more strength. Next one is the loss of nuclear control. Nuclear in this case refers to nucleus. If the organelles, as a cell grows, if those organelles get too far from the nucleus, it is harder for the nucleus to direct their activities. And that distance itself becomes a problem. If you think of a small country, maybe something like Monaco, all the things are within a few kilometers, very easy to control that country. Communication, simple, all the rest of it. If you look at Canada, we're spread out a long way. It's very hard for Ottawa to control all this. So that's just simply an analogy. As a cell gets bigger, the organelles get farther from the nucleus, and that means it's harder to control the organelles' functions. Now, number 3 is the math one. And it says the surface area to volume ratio gets too small. The surface of a cell, so when you see surface area, think of cell membrane. When you think of volume, think of the cell itself. And the cell membrane we've just talked about, the cell membrane regulates what can enter and leave. And our problem is, as a cell grows, our surface area gets bigger, but our volume gets bigger and the ratio actually gets smaller. We're going to try to show that with a picture. Let's pretend that the cell is a cube and it looks like this. Well, if I had a cell like this, I know the formula for volume is length times length times length. So let's just make the numbers easy and say the length is 1. 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. So that is my volume. That's the cell itself. Now my surface area, I need the area of one side. 1 times 1 is 1. And I have 6 sides. So my surface area would be 6. Now if I double that, so instead of 1, now I make the cell twice as big. All of a sudden it becomes 2 on every side. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So my volume, the cell itself, has now become a volume of 8. Now I have to look at my area. Well, I have 2 times 2 is 4, and then 4 times 6 is 24. Now I take 24, that's my surface area, divide by the 8, and I get a number of 3. My ratio was 6 when it was half the size. Double the size, it drops to 3. You probably did not catch all that, so we're going to plug in some numbers into a chart. So here it says what the length is. Here it says what the surface area formula is, the formula for volume, and then the ratio, comparing cell membrane to the cell itself. So we said, hey, 6 to 1, 6 to 1 ratio. Then we did it in our heads here, and we said, oh, our total surface area is 24. Our total volume, 2 times 2 times 2, is 8, and we get a 3 to 1 ratio. Well, you can kind of see a pattern happening here. If I go 4 times 4, that equals 16. 16 times 6 is 96. So my volume has increased, or my surface area has increased. And now this time I have 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64. If I take 96 divided by 64, cell membrane compared to the cell, I get a 1.5 to 1 ratio. I do it again, but this time I say 8. 8 squared is 64. 64 times 6 is 384. That's my surface area. It's gone up again. My volume is going to be 8 times 8 times 8, which is 512. And so I take that number, divide by that number, and I get 0.75 to 1. I do it one more time. 16 squared times 6 is 1536. 16 times 16 times 16 is 4096. And I get a ratio of 0.375 to 1. You say, well, why does this number, this is what we really care about over on here, why does that matter? Well, what we're seeing is, each case, our length is doubling. So we're going times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2. Our surface area goes up by 4. 6 times 4, 24. 24 times 4, 96. 96 times 4, 384. And multiply by 4 again, and we get 1536. So, that's good. More cell membrane. But here's the problem. Our volume doesn't go up by a factor of 4, it goes up by 8. Times 8, times 8, times 8, times 8. The net effect is, I get a decrease in the ratio of the surface area to volume. And that means I get a decrease in the ratio of cell membrane every time. 6 divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2. And that's what our problem is. We see as the cell gets bigger, its surface area increases. As the cell gets larger, its volume increases. But our problem is the volume increases faster than the surface area. And that ratio of surface area to volume decreases. Now that's a problem. It's a massive problem. If we go back to these numbers, this would be like you're at a restaurant and you got 6 waiters and waitresses looking after you. And you're just being served whatever you want, it's coming. And then you get a little bigger because you've eaten. And now your ratio is 3 to 1. You're down to 3 waiters or waitresses. Still not a big problem. Things going pretty well. Now you're down to 1.5 waiters or waitresses. That's a little scary to see a half one. It gets worse. All of a sudden you have 3/4 of a waiter or waitress looking after you. And now by this point you've got 3/8 of a waiter or waitress. What that means in English is it's harder to get materials in the cell you need, like oxygen and sugar. And it's hard to get rid of waste, like carbon dioxide. And that's what it's going to talk about down here. It says number 3 is the key. If that ratio goes down, it means we have less cell membrane for the cell's volume, harder to get things in and out, and you're not going to have to do math on any kind of test on this topic, but it's important you understand, as a cell gets bigger, the amount of cell membrane compared to the volume decreases. So it says, how does it cope with this? Hey, the cell divides. And next year you learn about cell division through a process called mitosis.